everybody, to the Parrot Stars podcast. My name is Alexis Highland. I am the manager at Parrot Stars, and I am joined today by Ashley and Avery, who work with me at Parrot Stars, and my birds are around here somewhere, along with the dogs. Oh, there's a dog eating Nutriberries. Okay. So, today we wanted to do a fun topic. What makes a parrot a parrot? So, this might seem a little silly to listeners who are like, obviously, I know what a parrot is. But the goal with this episode is just to have it be kind of fun and hopefully very informative and interesting to kind of discuss why parrots are so unique, so incredible, and what sets them apart from all other types of birds on the planet. One of the biggest things, obviously, about parrots is we will never see them naturally occurring up here in Chicagoland. And part of that is our weather. So most parrot species are come from the southern hemisphere. So they actually are not in the northern hemisphere. Well, some of them do have ranges that extend into the northern hemisphere, but they don't really occur naturally there. So there are some unique exceptions to that rule. So interesting fact is that up here in Chicagoland, we do have wild populations of Quaker parrots. They also go by the name monk parakeets. So they're kind of our cool, interesting exception to the rule of you'll never see a parrot flying around outside in Chicago because they do. One of the cool things about Quaker parrots and the reason they're able to survive our cold, harsh Chicago winters is that they're kind of communal breeders that construct their own nests. So typically, parrots nest in tree cavities that were already excavated by other animals. This is a very common trait of how parrots nest in the wild. The cool thing about Quakers is that, and you might watch this with your own companion Quakers if people have them, is that they're like weavers. They take little pieces of twigs and leaves and branches and they kind of construct their own nests. And as we'll talk about in this episode, parrots are very smart. So Quakers have kind of exploited all of the resources that are available to them in Chicago, like electrical box units that generate a lot of heat in cold weather. And that's often where we see the wild populations of Quakers nesting. So there are some unique qualities of Quaker evolution that make them able to create heat in the winter to survive the cold weather. But on average, an assumption to make about parrots in general is that they typically come from warmer climates and cannot survive cold weather.
Now, of course, those the Quakers are not wild.
True.
Right.
Yes.
So
you should tell people how they got there.
Yeah. Unfortunately, probably from people that have either the bird has escaped or have people that just release the birds for whatever reason. So that's how the population's established. I think I've heard from actually a few customers there's a significant, not just a few, but like a significant population in Millennium Park.
Yes.
Maybe.
There's a huge flock.
I haven't seen them myself, but I mean, I don't go there that much, but that's kind of crazy, you know?
So I was walking down Chicago, like downtown Chicago, and I kind of like seek out parrot murals in my travels and my things, like time out away from Parrot Stars. There's actually several parrot murals in Chicago. So I found my first one, like right downtown. There's this beautiful cockatoo that's painted on the side of a building. But we were walking downtown and there's this beautiful mural of a Quaker parrot. And it's because there's so many Quaker parrots that live in the city of Chicago. But yeah, there's supposedly a huge population of them. I have never seen one flying around outside, but I know they do exist here. So the native habitat of Quaker parrots is South America. This is where they're native to. This is where they evolved to survive. So yes, any Quakers that are flying around Chicago now are ones that would have either been removed from the wild back in the day, okay, not recently, hopefully, or they were bred in captivity. They were likely people's pets, and then they got out and then found other Quakers that had also escaped and kind of started their own little community of Quakers. So yeah, most parrots are going to come from the southern hemisphere in really tropical climates. Now, some species live in very desert-like environments, although most are in very tropical rainforesty types of climates, and they survive and thrive in all different types of elevations. So some parrots can be found in really high elevations, especially in South America, where you start getting into a lot of the like really high mountain ranges, which tend to be cooler climates, but they've kind of evolved over time to survive a variation in temperature but for the most part, they're from really warm climates. And part of the reason that they thrive in these kinds of environments is because most often really warm climates have a lot of diversity in plant and food availability. So kind of an interesting thing about parrots is that we don't have a ton of information about their diet and what they're currently eating in the wild. So there's over 300, almost 400 species of parrot, but there's not a lot of studies on what specific parrots eat. So there's kind of general assumptions that they eat a lot of seeds and nuts and fruit, but part of the reason they live in the areas of the world that they do is because they're birds. They have sustained flight. They have to have a very fast metabolism. They burn a lot of calories. So they have to have constant food availability and not just seasonal food availability. They have to have food availability just throughout the day. So they are typically moving or changing their diet depending on the time of year and what fruits are available at different times of the year. But for the most part, they have to live in really diverse and dynamic environments to make sure that they're able to eat enough in the day's time to sustain all of the activity that they do.
So what's interesting, I've found with what you said about there's not much of studies, and it's kind of weird. And I find fascinating because these are birds that really anybody on the planet can recognize as a parrot. They can see it. Well, some of the most famous parrots, I should say. There's some obscure species that are kind of strange to some people. But like they see a macaw, like that's a parrot. Everybody knows what it is. But when you really dive into the research, there's very little studies of the actual birds functioning in their natural habitat, which of course implicates, their conservation status and the fortunality about that. But I just think it's interesting because almost every study deals with domesticated, or excuse me, I shouldn't say domesticated. I always said talk
Captive
about that.
bred.
Yes, captive, what I was trying to say. So that's just what I find fascinating about parrots.
Yeah, it's exciting but also motivating that like there's so much research to be done
Right.
about parrots.
Yes.
So we kind of know their ranges. We know that they don't necessarily migrate. They do move. They're not just typically isolated to certain specific spots. Some species do live in very specific regions and don't move outside of their range throughout their lifetime. But for the most part, they're not making migrations like hummingbirds or other seabirds do, where they might be covering whole continents of travel in a year's time. Parrots usually stay within their range and don't move outside of that very often. But they are found on multiple continents. So the most diversity does come from South America, but there are parrots that are found in Africa, all of Asia, Southeast Asia, and then Australia, and a lot of islands kind of in between all of those continents. I think Avery's going to talk a little bit about evolution, but they've evolved to survive in totally dynamic parts of our world, yet certain aspects of parrots have stayed consistent regardless of how they've changed on their specific continent. So I think that's really cool is that there's they're coming from all over the world, yet a parrot is still a parrot for certain reasons. So, yeah.
Yeah. So, but species wise, just to put into context, because a lot of people are surprised that come into the store and we talk about our cockatoos that we have, or our little cockatiels, which are one of the most popular and famous parrot species, is that those cockatoos and teals are from Australia, and Southeast Asia, of course. And so there's a lot of times that people aren't too well versed in parrots, or maybe even have a parrot, but they just don't know is that not all parrots are from South America. Like Africa, like you mentioned with your most famous African grays. I mean, they're called that for a reason. Then your Senegal parrots and your Cape parrots that are just adorable. All the Poicephalus genus are from Africa. You have your lovebirds that are also a very popular species, but surprising to people that they are from Africa and Madagascar. There's populations in Madagascar. But then, of course, rolling back to South America are your famous macaws, your conures. Every other bird we send home is like a green cheek conure. And so those are just from down south. And yeah, your Amazons, of course. So it's just really cool that some of these really recognizable species are from literally the entire globe.
So part of our big education effort is to try to bridge that gap first from what people are seeing in captivity and like their natural history and talking to them about where they come from, what their conservation status is, and whether or not they're endangered. Because I think it is really, really important for people to kind of really see them and and value them in captivity, but then also kind of make that link of, okay, but they also have a wild counterpart. Where are they coming from? What's their situation in the wild?
Yeah, so I just find it fascinating of the natural history behind it. And like you said at the beginning, we're going to talk about just a little bit of the evolutionary history. I mean,
Go for it.
We should just do an entire podcast about evolution.
For real.
But I know a big topic we're going to talk about is physically what makes a parrot, which is really cool. So which order do we want to go in here?
Doesn't matter. However you want to
I guess it doesn't matter.
So let's bring it back to like our concrete examples at Parrot Stars. So when you walk into Parrot Stars, one of our most popular birds at our store is like the one non-parrot that we have.
Yeah, that's true.
It's a little Indian hill myna bird, not a parrot, not even closely related to a parrot, but to kind of help people like distinguish, okay, we see this bird, we see a parrot. What about a parrot makes it specifically a parrot that's common among all parrot species?
Yeah. And I mean, if you look at our little myna bird compared to all the parrots in the room, there's some really obvious anatomical differences. I think most obvious is going to be the beak. So parrots have what is called a hookbill. It's literally a curved beak. If you look at our little myna bird or canaries, songbirds, you're going to see more of like a straight pointed beak.
Triangular beak.
Yeah. And you'll see variants in different types of beaks depending on a bird's ecological function. But with parrots, it's a curved hookbill.
A big old beak.
Oh yeah.
Huge.
It's a big beak. And you can get you can break it down more just like us. They do have two separate jaws. So for them, the top beak is called the maxilla, bottom one's mandible. But when we look at that beak, yes, it's a powerful tool, but it gives the birds so many cool abilities. So parrots have a hookbill. It gives them prehensile abilities, which is a term that basically means they can do kind of what we do with our thumbs. We can grasp things, we can support things, we can manipulate things. So that hookbill is really distinctive for them, but it also helps them function as a parrot. So that's a really cool thing about them is having those separately moving jaws. The top bill, the maxilla, holds things in place. It gives them flexibility. And then that mandible, which is that bottom jaw, gives a lot of that power that comes for crushing nuts, for breaking down branches, doing things like that. And something I get asked a lot at the store is about the quote unquote hole we see at the
Right.
bottom
Yeah.
of the bottom jaw when parrots lift their head up or turn to the side. So this isn't a physical hole in their body. It's called the interermal space. And basically what it does is functions as a little gap. It gives them a little bit more movability with that bottom jaw. And again, if we're looking at all birds, that's not something you're going to see on all birds. So what makes a parrot unique? This helps them with their breathing when the beak is closed. It also protects their tongue bone, which is really cool. Parrots have a bone in their tongue. And I don't know if you want to talk a little bit more about the tongue bone and how that functions for parrots and what makes them kind of unique.
Yeah, sure. But going back to the bill, though,
Yeah.
because I think the bill, and besides the plumage,
Yes.
which we'll talk about, is one of the most key characteristics that actually defines parrots as parrots in the Psittaciformes order.
Mm-hmm.
But it's cool how flexible they are, and if you see it in practice, it's absolutely fascinating. Like our palm cockatoo at the store, when he's on a perch, he's trying to reach a toy or a foraging toy, or even just trying to get his mouth around something huge because he can. It stretches. It's goofy.
Way
See,
out there.
it stretches way out there, and he's already has a honking beak. And when he stretches it, it just looks like it's like half his face.
Yeah.
It's unbelievable.
It's really impressive. But all parrots can do that. Like when Rascal talks, some words that she pronounces requires her to stretch her upper mandible or upper maxilla out way far, and it's really funny and goofy, but it's really cute in that sense.
For people who haven't had hands-on experiences with parrots, that beak is such a point of conversation often
Mhm. Right.
because people kind of know parrots are strong and that beak is so powerful. Can't be understated, like how at the same time, how much control they have over their beak, because it also can be the most gentle and like fragile movement and touch that you'll ever experience from an animal. So it is really fascinating how it's so opposing, how you have this incredible strength and power and crushing power and pressure, yet at the same time, they have the ability to preen each other's eyelashes.
Yeah.
Like they have like the tiniest little smallest eyelashes. They do have them. And yet I've watched them sit side by side and have the fragility of being able to be so incredibly gentle with their beak at the same time.
I've seen the palm pick up like tiny little barrel toys that we usually designate for small birds. He's strong enough to just crunch that, and he is so gentle and delicate and flips it around because he likes to play with it. So like they're very intentional and purposeful with how they use that beak.
Yeah. But in the wild, we're talking about a beak that has about, studies showed, 200 to 300 pounds of potential bite pressure. So think of, it's cool to think about.
Yeah.
But inside the beak is, of course, what we were talking about, the tongue, which is another fascinating thing because if people come to the store or see them in exhibits at zoos that have been, rehabilitated or something, is their tongue is always moving around. It's always in motion because it's an extremely flexible organ that they have in their body. And like you said, it has the bone on the inside that's called the paraglossal bone, which connects to a series of other bones, which allows that flexibility to manipulate their food, which is really cool. And then, of course, they use the tongue and the beak to actually eat, get the shells off the nuts that they find forage in the wild. So that's really cool about the tongue. And it always seems, now I'm not too sure about the color. Do you know some colors are different if you were able to find something about that?
Yeah. I mean, it usually, from what I was reading, the tongue is usually going to match the color of the beak in some capacity.
Okay,
So
that's
if
what I
you're
was
looking at
thinking.
our palm, his tongue is red and then the tip is black. And
Right.
when you look at his face, he's got red cheeks that flush and then a dark black beak.
Interesting.
So it's typically
Okay.
going to kind of mirror the colors you're seeing on their beaks.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's cool.
And all that so many parrots look so different side by side, but yes, there's so many different color variations and there's all different kind of colors and shapes too the beaks.
Mhm.
So you keep talking about the palm, and I think it's just because that
Well,
palm beak is so distinctly different than what you
right.
typically see in a macaw or a South
Yeah.
American parrot, where it seems very kind of round and kind of compact, where the palm is so like elongated and narrow. Yet they both serve the same purpose and evolved for the same reasons. But oh my gosh, it's just
Yeah,
incredible.
his tongue is always going.
Yep.
All those different looking beaks are all hookbills. So even amongst cockatoos, you're going to see variance in the types of beaks. So I joke that if you saw the beak of a black palm cockatoo on a different species of bird, that might be a little concerning because his is highly specialized with a very long upper maxilla there. And it's got like a nice flat ridge for holding things in place. But when we look at umbrella cockatoos, cockatiels, we'll see similarities in the bottom jaw structure. But that top hookbill is going to look a little different on each one, and yet they're all hookbills. It's very cool.
Again, you have to kind of like really trust and have a lot of mutual respect with your companion parrot if you're going to ever feel its tongue. But we've all
Yes.
felt their tongues because we have good
Yeah.
relationships with our birds, and they don't have hands, so they are using their tongue to investigate
Yeah.
everything. But yeah, that bone in there makes it feel like a little index finger. It is
Mhm.
crazy. Like we kind of sometimes forget, like we don't have a bone in our tongue. It's just like cartilage and muscle. It's just not anything that's super, even though there's a lot of flexibility in our tongues, like a parrot tongue has so much strength and power in it as well. So they use it so much, and when they eat and when they play, and sometimes like we get them to stick it out on command. It's just really ridiculous and cute. But people are always like wondering why, if like what it feels like, but they don't produce as much saliva as we do. So it's very dry, and they don't have like gritty taste buds like we do. So it's pretty smooth. But if you ever have the opportunity to feel it, it is odd how similar it feels to somebody's index finger touching you.
It's a good way to
crazy.
describe it.
Mhm.
Yeah.
It's fascinating. Yeah, but the tongue is really cool.
Mhm.
Mhm.
But moving onto more of the head,
Mhm.
the eyes are really awesome because they're really unique, especially like the cockatoos because they're like little bug eyes. But there's a lot of complex things about them, which is really fascinating.
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, I think something that a lot of people have seen either in person or in media is eye pinning on parrots. So that's going to be when they contract and expand the shape of their pupils, usually in reaction to something scary, exciting, some sort of stimulus. And it's usually quite rapid with them. This actually happens because they have a third eyelid that allows them to pin like that. And it's typically an involuntary reaction to certain stimulus. So, we've talked about observing our bird's body language before. If you have a bird that has very expressive eyes, watch the pinning. They can be telling you, I'm a little nervous right now if it's going like crazy. But I know we've talked about parrots having more of a prey setup anatomically. Humans, predatory birds, we have forward facing eyes. When we look at our parrots, their eyes are on either side of their head, which is common amongst a lot of prey animals. This does give them broader visual range. They can see a lot more than just our forward facing eyes do. They also have monocular vision, which I think is fascinating. This basically means that each eye can focus on something different at the same time. So while our parrot might be like looking down and their head's tilted up, they're observing everything below and above them when they're looking at something, or everything to the right and to the left. And that helps them take in a huge picture of what's around them. If you're a prey animal, you need to see as much as you can around you just to make sure there's no predators coming up on you. I'm always fascinated by that monocular vision that they do have.
Yeah, and I think those are all things that help hopefully companion owners understand their birds better. Yes, the eye pinning, we're probably never going to be able to definitively say the reason a bird is pinning its eyes at a specific moment. But we don't have that ability. And it is, in my opinion, okay, a way that they are trying to express emotion. And it's not happening typically when they're in a completely relaxed state. It is happening when they're very heightened. So it's something to be observant of and to take into consideration when you're engaging with a parrot, maybe even if it's not in your home, but you're seeing it out in the world somewhere. If it's pinning its eyes, it usually means that it's very, very heightened for maybe excitement and enjoyment, but also maybe for fear. And then I think something else to relay to people is that parrots have all different color irises too. So some parrots, and where we're kind of mentioning that you can see the pinning so dramatically, often have very light colored eyes. So you can see the change in their pupil dilation very obviously. But a lot of parrots have very dark brown eyes, or sometimes even almost they appear to be black. And they still have the ability to dilate in various situations. You just don't see it as dramatically. But yeah, any parrot has the ability to do that. Even if they have the darker eyes, they still can do it.
It does really feel like it's a form of expression, even though there's not too many studies that show that. But like, for example, Rascal, when you give her a little treat, you see her little, yeah, just her little eyes, shrink, and she goes,
She does.
Does.
But it's also a good indicator. So, like our other resident Amazon, Toby, when he gets a little nervous or something spooks him, maybe something loud in the room, you can really see it, and so it's a good indicator. Like, just give him some space,
Absolutely.
but then it's usually fine. But yeah, it's definitely a form of expression that is good to understand about your bird.
Totally.
Yeah. And I think looking at the whole context of a situation can kind of help us maybe better understand what's going on with those pinnings.
Of course. Yeah.
And they have a huge range of motion in their heads, but they are different than owls. Like owls can, even though they have the ability to turn their head, they have eyes on the front of their face. So even though a prey animal or a parrot has their eyes on the side of their head, they have a huge range of vision, but it's not 360.
Right.
And they can turn their head very, very far, but there are still going to be blind spots.
Yes.
So keep that in mind when you're approaching parrots or engaging with them. They can see you coming from pretty far away, but you still can't spook them or come from behind. You always kind of want to position yourself in a way where it's undeniable that the parrot sees you coming for it, because we are predatory, so you don't want to spook them, but they don't have the ability to see every single angle at one given time. They do have to turn their heads in order to see everything. So one thing that I talk about in the classroom setting all the time, because it comes up, is their incredible ability to see color. And I think it's something that comes up at the store all the time, because our store is like basically like a rainbow exploded.
Yes.
Like there's color everywhere, because they have incredible eyesight and ability to receive color. So if you guys want to talk a little bit about parrot vision.
So, they can see red, green, and blue, but I think one of the coolest things is that they can actually see UV lighting, which is ultraviolet lighting. When we try to replicate what parrots see, it tends to be with a UV light. So we see things with like a tint of purple. They're not seeing things in purple like that.
Right.
That's like the best way that we can possibly conceptualize how they're seeing things. When they perceive that UV light, it's in reflections and in refractions of light. It gives a lot of contrast. So it can help them with foraging. It can help them to see different patterns on, a mate on their body. It's going to look different sometimes for certain species on males or females, those patterns that reflect in UV light. What I think is really cool is that it helps them in rearing their chicks too. So the chicks are going to have reflective patches to kind of help mom and dad see where they're at, usually on their foreheads. And compiling information for this podcast, a really cool bit of research I came across was that smaller chicks or underweight chicks are going to have larger UV reflective patches to kind of highlight those individuals from their siblings, for mom and dad, to make sure that they are feeding them maybe first or giving them enough. So very, very cool. But that UV light vision is incredible. if you ever have a chance to like look at pictures of parakeets under UV light, I mean, again, it's not going to be purple like it is in our pictures that we see, but they look really different with UV light projected on them compared to how they look just regularly to us. So it gives us like a window into what they see.
Yeah, and I think it's so easy to like have your like very like human experience point of view on the world, and you forget that there's all these other things happening around us, and there's
Mhm.
all these animals that are evolved to see things completely different than we are. So I often have to like kind of check myself because like for me, it's just like I'm going through life and I see what I see. And they're seeing a whole nother world that we cannot see. And it's just
It is
fascinating.
fascinating.
It's unbelievable.
So the science behind it, when I was in school, is the cones.
Yes.
So humans have 3 cones,
In
the
their
primary
eye, yeah.
colors, but parrots have a 4th little cone, which of course takes in the light. Your brain then transforms it based into colors and shapes. Or sorry, not the shapes, but the picture.
Mhm.
So that's just really fascinating how parrots can, not just parrots, but birds in general, they all have the 4th cone, which is cool. It's just cool.
And I mean, there's evolutionary strategies to having that 4th cone in the eye. Again, it helps them with foraging. They're going to have more contrast. There's a really cool documentary by David Attenborough called Life in Color. I don't know if it's still floating out there, but if you have an opportunity to watch it, he has an episode dedicated to UV light and how that looks for plants and insects and animals. So it really helps them find their food, know what is a potentially hazardous item, what is safe to go near, is that a good mate, that sort of thing. So there's a lot of purpose behind them having the ability to see ultraviolet light.
That kind of plays into probably why a lot of species of birds are very vibrantly colored, some more than others,
Mhm.
but all birds have unique color patterns. But specifically, ones that are very vibrantly colored, there's usually reasons behind it.
Mhm.
But I think that's also something that makes parrots so recognizable is that they are often very dynamically colored. So
Yeah.
some species are maybe a very similar color top to bottom or only have a little bit of color variation on their body. And then you have a species like a scarlet macaw that almost has what feels like every color of the rainbow, or a sun conure that really genuinely does
Yeah.
have almost every
Yeah.
color of the rainbow. Our rainbow,
Yes.
our little
Yeah.
non-UV rainbow. But yeah, they're incredibly colorful. So
And they're colorful all year round, no matter what, for the
Oh.
most part, with the exception of a parrot that might be on a poor diet. But assuming they're having a really healthy diet, they look the same all the time. And that's because those color pigments in their feathers aren't contingent on their diet. So canaries, depending on what they're eating, might be more red or orange looking. Flamingos are a really
The
easy
famous example, yeah.
Yes, like they will be one color depending on what the food is that they're eating, and another time of the year they're going to be more pinkish.
Mhm.
Parrots are always rascals red and rainbowy all year round, no matter what she's eaten. So that's pretty cool too.
That's cool. And some of that does go to the natural ecology.
Mhm.
Studies show it's a variety of names. Most of it, the hypotheses go under. There's a study, the Zahavi's handicap hypothesis. It's usually a handicap something hypothesis,
Mhm.
but it's also goes to the fecundity, which is like the ability to mate and produce. The fitness of the bird is basically the better shape they are,
Mhm.
the more likely they are to reproduce. So if you have a scarlet macaw that is in complete contrast to the rainforest around it, if that bird is to
Mhm.
look pristine and gorgeous, or it's an opinion term, but I'm
Mhm.
sure some of the females would, or they see it that way, even though males and females are identical, it just shows the fitness of the bird that they are able to survive with this handicap. So that's also fascinating. How it's like I hesitate to use terms like a disadvantage.
Mhm.
Technically, it is, but like because evolution doesn't really work that way, which is a whole nother topic. I know it's a rabbit hole after rabbit hole.
Yes, in a world where camouflage is so much of the survival
Right.
technique of how animals have evolved to reproduce,
Yes.
it is interesting and fascinating that birds, and there's other animals that
Of
have this
course.
exception, but birds are the exact opposite of camouflage.
Right.
They are, yeah, in one aspect, you would look at that and say, what is the survival advantage to standing out so vividly in your environment for a prey animal? I mean, they
Yeah.
are a prey animal that could be preyed upon. And yet something about being colorful and the survivability of being colorful supersedes whatever the risk is of predation in order for them to evolve that way.
And
So a lot of-
something really,
Excuse me, sorry.
I was going to say, just fun fact for depending on color. So reds and oranges can be very similar to greens, not necessarily for us, but if you're colorblind or have difficulty differentiating these colors, they look really, really similar. And a lot of predators might be perceiving light differently, where that red and green blend in. So that scarlet macaw is virtually invisible to them. Same with the tiger, where like a big orange cat walking through the jungle. How do they not see it? That orange can blend in with the green, especially if they're sitting very still.
Yes.
And parrots get scared and they sit
Really
still.
complex,
So
yeah.
it depends on the color too and the environment. A scarlet macaw in Africa would probably pop compared to being in, a really heavily forested jungle area.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely.
And of course, not all birds have this adaptation. It's mostly like you tend to see it a lot more with birds in the equatorial region. So, like parrots and the birds of paradise and other things like that. But then, of course, there's the opposite, like owls, even though this is a parrot podcast, but you have to have a really trained eye, or the owl needs to be flailing around or doing something goofy that it would
Yes.
probably never do in order for you to see an owl.
And virtually invisible.
Yeah,
Yes.
they're just yeah.
So hard to spot.
Unbelievable.
So without getting into the whole magic of all birds, but that is something that does really set parrots apart. Just their absolute
Yeah.
color.
And I think something that comes up or that we experience because we're breeding birds in captivity and we're working in the pet world is that there is a difference between the wild type. And when we say wild type, that's like what is the traditional mutation that's occurring in the wild. So versus a color mutation that's existing in captivity
Right.
that we've kind of bred over time to appear more. So breeding and genetics is, again, a complex topic, probably not for this episode. But often when you're seeing, for example, I think the best example is like an Indian ringneck. Okay. So if you know Indian ringnecks, and especially if you know them in the United States, but I think in other parts of aviculture where they're existing not in their natural habitat, they come in so many dynamic color mutations. But in the wild, they're green. They're green and that's it. But with intentional breeding, they've developed higher likelihood to have a color mutation. So when you see a violet or a blue or a white or yellow Indian ringneck, that's not the color that it's going to be in the wild. This is a color mutation. And so kind of similar to like Labradors who are yellow, chocolate, or black, these are color mutations through active intentional breeding. Something kind of for people to distinguish when they see these beautiful like violet or blue parrots, often not what the wild counterpart looks like, although it is absolutely stunning and beautiful. Just always keeping that in the back of your mind as you're observing parrots that sometimes in captivity they look very, very drastically different than what they do in the wild.
So we've worked down from the beak to the tongue to the eyes to the plumage. But I think one of the last big things that people notice is a little different from a lot of other birds, especially the little birds they see out in their backyard, is it's the feet.
Yes.
Yeah, they're big old toes.
Yeah. So parrots have zygodactyl feet. This is also something that I do in the elementary school talks because I think even from a young age, when you're learning about birds, you kind of envision their 3 toes facing forward and 1 tiny toe in the back. So Birds of prey often have this toe formation. Water birds, we have songbirds that all have the 3 toes facing forward and 1 tiny toe in the back. But parrots have 2 forward facing toes and 2 rear facing toes. Not only that, their toes are incredibly muscular. So birds of prey, of course, have very muscular, very strong toes. Songbirds do not. So parrots rely heavily on their toes for survival. It's how they hold and pick up their food. Some parrots more than others. Some use their feet all the time while they're eating, some don't. But they rely on it for climbing. So a lot of other species of birds don't have the ability to climb. Again, a little bit because of their big hooked bill beak. Parrots can climb, so they rely on their beak or their really, really strong toes in order to navigate without having to fly from point A to point B. They can climb.
Yeah. So similar, just to bring it back home, is woodpeckers have zygodactyl-shaped feet, 2 toes in front, 2 toes in back. Excellent foot structure for gripping and clinging.
Yep.
Now, a lot of parrots in the wild, especially a lot of macaws, they will cling to cliff surfaces and cavities where they nest, but it just adds a lot of strength and leverage for their big bodies to grip onto the branches and things like that. So it's just adds that extra adaptation, which is fascinating because woodpeckers and parrots are pretty
So different.
they're not directly related, which is another term for evolutionary convergence.
You
But
can't tell, we're all a bunch of biology majors. It is really fascinating.
it is fascinating
how that's something that has evolved into completely different species, yet it's something that's made their survivability better. And it adds to their ability to forage or survive. And it's fascinating. And I would assume, I'm not the woodpecker expert. Avery definitely knows his native birds better than I do. But I think the other really fascinating thing about parrot feet and that what you feel when you're working with parrots, in captivity, is how every segment of the toe has a lot of strength and power. And they don't have what we consider talons.
Right.
I mean, our vernacular is that we say toenails rather than talons. But all the way up to their toenail, they can support their entire body weight with just one tiny segment of their toe or just their toenail. And again, that's for the clinging and the climbing. It's a trait that is very unique to having this type of foot structure that allows them to support so much of their body weight with just one tiny segment of one toe or just their toenail.
That always blows my mind too. I mean, you'll see our conures swinging by a toenail.
So
one
strong.
toenail.
It's crazy. It's a wonderful, very cool adaptation. It also kind of supports that arboreal lifestyle that they have, which is going to be climbing through trees.
Right.
Arboreal refers to trees, and having strong feet like that lets them navigate those complex network of branches, lets them support their body weight, or kind of like you were saying, just to really nest in certain areas or even perch a little bit differently than other types of birds.
So I know now there's studies that go back and forth about the evolutionary branching of parrots, which isn't really solidified or widely accepted. But birds of prey, though they have different feet structure, actually have muscle locking in their toes for gripping prey. Of course, that if they lock those talons, because birds of prey do have talons, that it is you can't get
They're
those
not letting
apart.
go.
Yeah, that is solid muscle lock there. But parrots, though, I can't speak too much on it, but they have some really strong. When they get their feet on something, you
cannot pull it apart.
They're stuck on there. So whether they have a similar convergent muscle like that, I'm not sure. I can't speak on it, but it's just fascinating how much strength they really do
They
have.
really do. And I think it goes back to like their, I think, and we're going to go into their intelligence here in a second. I think this plays into their intelligence too, is that, and I don't know about birds of prey, but like that's an instinctual response, that locking mechanism. And I think with parrots, it fascinates me how much control they have over that grip.
Yeah.
Because that grip strength is unbelievable.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, when you have a nervous bird that kind of grasps
squeezes
around your hand or your arm or whatever, I mean, it is unbelievable the strength that they have in
Little
their feet.
parrotlets. You can't get those.
You cannot.
You
It's
can't
just-
open the toes up.
And
No.
it's the same with the beak. Like if they close their beak, you cannot open it. Like they have to choose to release it
Yeah.
in order to alleviate the pressure that they're applying. And I think the cool thing about parrots is that they have so much control over it. Like the finesse and the ability to be so gentle. Like Rascal, I mean, her feet are so humongous.
Yeah.
Yet, as long as she's had a good nail trim recently, like she's so gentle when she's holding on to you. But then at the same time, if somebody walks behind her or startles her, and then all of a sudden she's got to like increase her grip, you're like, oh my gosh, Rascal, you need to loosen your grip a little bit.
It's cool.
But it is unbelievable to feel it every day.
Yeah. But I think one more thing though about anatomy, because we talk about it all day, but before we do get into actual like where parrots came from and why they are so famous, is the actual skeleton. And of course, there's a lot of features of the skeleton that is pretty universal for parrots, like the keel, that big old bone that structures the flight muscles, because obviously parrots fly. But I think when you look, and if you just look up a picture of a parrot skeleton, doesn't need to be a specific species, it's mind-boggling because it looks so cartoonish and disproportionate to kind of a balanced skeleton, because the head is huge.
It is.
Like it's like, I don't know actual numbers, but it looks like it's a pretty big proportion of the skeletal weight. I mean, it's ginormous. Like we have a green wing currently in our boarding area, little Benny. I say little, but he's huge. His head, that's the biggest head I've ever seen on a parrot
Humongous.
compared to the rest of his body. And his body's pretty big, but his head takes up like half, like,
Yeah.
the
It's
whole
huge.
thing. It's crazy. So it's just fascinating how kind of they've structured themselves. So I just think that's cool.
Yeah,
I wanted to
I
mention.
guess encouraging people to look up their skeleton is a good suggestion because I think it would give people a lot of insight.
If you want to see what I'm talking about, like a macaw skeleton, and
Yeah.
it's just, I think the beak does a lot of the disproportionizing, if that's a word, because their beak is so ginormous. So you're like, whoa, that's a big structure.
Yep.
I think just in general, the head's huge. And then their tail feathers are so long,
Yeah.
which the feathers have nothing to do with the actual like skeletal structure, but they're little piga style where the tail feathers connect to. It's just a little itty bitty kind of nub proportionate body. I just wanted to mention the skeleton because it's pretty unique to parrots.
Yeah, and I think maybe that's a good point too, is to distinguish, because some people might, when they're asked to describe a parrot, they might instinctively picture either a short tail or a long tail. And the length of the tail isn't the defining feature or characteristic of a parrot.
Right.
Again, you have to be careful when you're like getting into like the family trees and how birds have evolved and how closely they're related. But there are true parrots that have short tails and parakeets that have long tails,
Of course.
and every version in between. So just because a parrot has a long tail or a short tail, that's not the defining characteristic, although the tail is incredibly important for all parrots. And usually they have a lot of control of the ability to fan their tail. It allows them to create balance during flight. And there must be some, I don't know what the answer is, but there must be some evolutionary advantage to some species having very long tails and then others having very short and stout tails. So I think all African species of parrot, well, I shouldn't say all because there's African parakeets, but like everything in the Pachycephалus family and the African grays, those all have the short tail. And they're not very closely related to the Amazon parrots that also have the short tail. Same thing, we have certain species of cockatoos that have short tails, and then we have cockatoos that have very long tails, like cockatiels. So it's crazy how they can all have their different features, yet
It is
they all
fascinating.
still are parrots.
But I think it's a good transition to where parrots kind of came from. And I'll keep it pretty brief, and we'll take it back a little bit, quite a bit, actually.
Because this is Avery's favorite topic in the whole world.
I know. I never grew out of my dinosaur phase.
Oh, I love it.
Yeah.
I love
think
it.
Ashley's on the same page.
Yes.
But studies show that parrots, based off of genetic data, started to show up, and this is a big approximate, but about 60 million years ago. Keep in mind, though, a million years is a pretty freaking long time in our perception. That's just 5 million years, again, approximate, after the Cretaceous Paleogene extinction, the most famous one, that the dinosaurs disappeared.
Yeah.
So 5 million years is a blink of an eye in terms of evolutionary history. So these are a very old order of birds. Did they look like your macaws and your little conures? No, probably not. But that's just fascinating how they've had so much time. And technically, you always hear that birds are dinosaurs. I guess you could think of it as saying like a human is like a chimpanzee, kind of. We come from the same now lineage, but we've all branched. But birds did come from the avian dinosaurs, and they were able to survive that extinction. But after the dinosaurs disappeared, all the niches around the planet, once we're recovering from the huge disaster of getting pummeled by a giant rock, all these niches opened up, which allowed birds to boom. And so, based off genetic data and then the tectonic plate structure of the planets and how the continents were at the time, studies show that parrots first kind of originated in the Gondwanan continent, which is south, the kind of the southern hemisphere. So back when South America was closer to Africa and Australia and even Antarctica, that's where they kind of originated. However, I found a study which is interesting by Gill et al. 2024. So actually, this year, the first fossil though of a psitticiform was found in Denmark. So, I mean, there's a lot of stuff behind that. I can't speak too much on it, but I just thought that was interesting, based off genetic data to actual physical paleontological data. So that's kind of that. But my point is they've had a long time to diversify. Studies show that the cockatoos are more of the older. And then the Psittacidae family, the New World parrots, and the Psittaculidae family of mostly the Asiatic parrots and the African parrots, kind of branched off. So it's been fascinating. And of course, with that time period, they've had all these evolutionary adaptations. But what makes a parrot most famous, respectively, is their intelligence. And so throughout this diversification, speciation, adaptation, they've developed attributes that have allowed them to really cognitively use their environment to their advantage. They have to use a lot of brain power for their ecological function, which mostly goes around foraging, finding food, problem solving to obtain that food in their environment. So that's
Working as a
fascinating.
team. Yep.
Yeah.
Social constructs
And the
all
social
require
constructs is huge. How they can,
intelligence.
social animals, the huge herds of wildebeest that you see in the documentaries, the massive flocks, starlings, parrots, and flocks, all have pretty intense and complex social structures, which makes communication key. And so that's something that's famous for parrots, of course, as we know, because parrots can, in quotes, talk. And there's a lot of really cool studies that show that, which go back to the intelligence. But intelligence-wise, there's a few cool things, is that parrots' brain-to-body ratio is very comparable to high primates and dolphins. Does that mean significant things? Can't really say, because like a shrew it's 10% of his body's his brain. Now, of course, he can get complexly into that, but I think it's fascinating how these animals have very kind of developed intellectual adaptations, which helps them survive. So, a percentage wise, like a Congo African gray, their brain to body percentage is about 1.7, whereas humans are about 2%.
Yeah.
It's very common.
So I think we as humans sometimes take for granted like how intelligent we are and how many problem solving skills we do in a day, and how much we use our brains in order to communicate and survive. And that's not necessarily the normal way that animals on the planet survive. And it's not as simple as like stimulus response for some animals. Like they do have complex brains and processing information, but we have this ability to have like really complex thoughts and analyze situations and have foresight. And like the research is still coming out, but the fact that we know that parrots have very comparable problem solving skills to young human children or other types of primates is something that we really have to take into consideration when we're choosing to have them as pets. I mean, their ability to feel emotion and comprehend it, and it's something that, yes, there's research on it and they can show that they do have very intelligent brains. But I think the cool thing is that we get to see it played out in a day-to-day scenario. And I think most people that have companion parrots or that really, really do care and love their companion parrots, like you can feel their emotion and their response to different situations. But I think the problem solving skills are really what blow people away. And like, even for me, classically, the Goffin's cockatoo tends to be a species that I can never get enough of their ability to look at an object and figure it out so quickly. If it's like a foraging toy or a lock or anything, a food. I mean, a Goffin's ability to use its foot, use its beak to manipulate things, to understand things, to make decisions is unlike anything I've ever seen outside of a human. It's unbelievable.
It is fascinating.
And parrots learn observationally, they learn socially, and they also learn independently. And you started talking about the Goffin's cockatoo, and I couldn't help but think of our little Goffin at the store, our resident Rue. Such a charismatic bird. Oh my gosh, is she intelligent? I mean, she watched us like twice change the thermostat, which is a touch screen. And when her cage used to be by it, she would go over there and just start touching it and turning that thermostat up. Oh my goodness.
Yeah, she made a game out of it.
From like 2 times watching us do it. Or when she would come in the office with me, I kid you not, I think I posted a video of it. She would sit and watch me type. And then pretty soon she would sit next to me and start working her foot and watching me type. And then before I know it, she's on the laptop, not using her beak, but trying to use her feet. I mean, it blows you away. And that's just her observational learning. I mean, if she was given the opportunity to maybe interact with that stuff differently, it's amazing what she might learn independently or socially. Yeah. And I'll joke sometimes when we're offering treats to like the cockatiels or the green cheeks, like if they're a little nervous, it just takes one to be brave and take that treat. And then everyone comes in. It's a great example of social learning though, too, learning from one another. Or when we see cockatoos using tools in the wild and in captivity, they're observing how things function around them, maybe observing another animal with that tool or a flock mate, or in captivity, observing us with that tool and then implementing it and perfecting it. I mean, it's incredible how they learn too.
Well, for the tools wise, which is fascinating because the black palm cockatoo, again, he's a great example for a lot of things, especially for this episode because the species is so unique. But it's widely known and seen, documented, recorded that in the wild they actually use tools. And they're one of the only very few animals on the planet that go out of their way to make a tool
Mm-hmm.
to serve a specific function. So they'll take sticks, branches in the wild, they will actually craft them.
Yeah.
They won't just pick it up and start doing what they need to do. They'll craft them to how they want it, and they will use it to hit hollow branches or hollow trunks to make a very specific sound to attract mates. And then, of course, along with that, they have their ritualistic singing.
Mm-hmm.
And studies show that every individual that's been recorded to do that is unique. It's like a whale song. Every whale sings their own song. Every black palm cockatoo has their own like timbre, has
Mm-hmm.
their own rhythm, has their own singing. It's really cool.
Yeah.
It's just crazy.
I think, again, I just can't say it enough how much we live in our perspective of 21st century humans, where we are surrounded by tools that have taken hundreds and thousands of years to like get us to where we're at now, where we just have tools at our disposal. But to evolve to create and use tools is extremely unique. I mean, in a world full of millions of different types of animals on the planet, I mean, to use tools is so unique and special to really higher level thinkers that if parrots are included in that category, it's one really phenomenal example of their comprehension skills and their ability to live in an environment that's highly dynamic and change the environment around them to make it serve them more. And most animals cannot do that. They're just existing and doing their best. But to manipulate and change your environment to serve your own needs and purposes is really high level thinking. And I think, again, the talking ability and the communication component is huge. And then there was a study that came out that did some research on some parrotlets where they were able to track that there were specific sounds that were being used to refer to specific individuals in the flock.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I don't want to misquote the study. I have to find it and make sure that
It was a great study. I read that too.
Okay, so basically, like I believe the parents were more or less naming the individuals in each clutch, and then they were able to track that those same sounds were being used throughout the parrot's life and as it continued to develop and mature and kind of enter the bigger flock. And that's just something that's only been able to be discovered because we as humans have developed incredible audio equipment that can trace and track that. So that's another thing that like really excites me because I'm big into like studies and how much we still have to learn about animals on this planet, is that like as our technology as humans increases, and we develop new stuff, like we're going to be able to understand animals better. And if that's something that's just now being able to be confirmed with parrots, which I think most parrot owners may have been able to say like, oh yeah, birds know what they're saying and why they're saying it. But to be able to now prove that they have the ability to name their individuals and they keep their names, again, that's highly unique to very intellectual creatures.
Yeah. I think to finish off this really cool conversation, of course, this was a total overview.
Yeah.
I mean, this is not even remotely like in depth, but is just to dwell on the talking a little bit more because that is so unique to parrots, is their ability to mimic the speech. And this isn't just parrots. I mean, there's a lot of species like your corvids, which are like your crows.
Yeah. This is a good point. Yeah.
And your mimids, like your mockingbirds, your brown thrashers. Like there's a study that shows the brown thrasher has the record number of mimic songs, about 3,000 different songs in their repertoire. So parrots aren't unique in that sense. And I think some of it does go for what we've set parrots up in the environment, our human perception, our human bias. Like, oh, they're the best talkers because they, repeat what I say. Well, and I kind of went down a rabbit hole in my research and I started to actually ask my own like scientific like hypotheses. Like if you had a brown thrasher in your house, if you had a mockingbird in your house, if you had an Indian hill mina bird in your house, likely you would be experiencing very similar, experiences. They would mimic what you say repetitively. But I think what makes parrots unique is that ability to sometimes contextualize what they do say.
Yep.
And of
make
course, that comes with being
associations.
taught appropriately. Parrots will contextualize saying good morning in the
In the
morning
morning, yep.
because that's when the owner always says good morning, is at that time of day. And they start to actually learn that. That's just how we learn language, you know?
Yeah. And like, or the classic example is like every time the phone rings, they say hello. And it's
Yeah, I mean, they're just
because there's context there. They hear the hello after the phone rings. Like this is, again, it's not just like they're regurgitating words back at us. There is something that's happening that's deeper than just repeating a sound. They're repeating a sound, yes, but it's in very like specific times and with certain intentions. And again, I mean, I don't know how much research there is in the pet world, okay, because it's hard to do real scientific studies. But again, I think just like in my personal observations, like I feel that those parrots are choosing to say certain things at certain times with intention, with the expectation of receiving a result after they've said it. And I think like the one that just cracks us all up is like whenever we drop something in the store and Rascal goes, uh-oh. And it's become this like thing that is hysterical. Or like, even if like for me, I spend a lot of time with her. Like if I'm just like making a weird face or I'm like looking at my phone, she'll go, uh-oh. Like she like reads my body language and knows like, uh-oh. Like Alexis is mad right now. And she just can tell. It's just really crazy.
You give her a treat, she says, something like
Do
that.
you remember Angel, the umbrella cockatoo? His contextual moment was so sweet. Like when something fell in the office and he just was like, it's okay, Angel. And like was a little nervous, but like self-soothing at the same time. Like it was so sweet, but it was an example of contextual mimicry there.
Yeah. So talking, of course, is really what makes parrots probably most famous and and I think a future episode, we're going to be talking maybe those origins.
Yeah.
Why people started to recognize that ability and started to implement parrots which brought them to what they are today.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's for the future. And that's just, again, a very brief overview of talking. There's so many studies I looked at just to kind of concrete what I was saying. But there's some really cool stuff going on.
We can talk. I mean, that's the fun thing I think about this podcast is, and what we're going to try to achieve is try to have a lot of educational content, but in all parts of parrot information. I mean, we're trying to really help people think about and care about their life in the wild, and conservation is deeply important to us. Having them have really quality lives in captivity is super important. But I like these fun episodes of just kind of like sharing our passion for parrots and why they're so incredible. And I'm excited for future episodes where we kind of have these one-off like fun conversations of just appreciating how incredible they are and how special they are.
They're cool.
Fun facts about parrots. I love it. I love it.
All right. So as always, guys, if you can rate and review our little podcast here, it really, really does help us out. If you can subscribe on YouTube, or if you can download or share it on all the other podcast platforms, it really does help spread the word about the podcast. The more feedback we get, the more people that hear our podcast. So that's kind of our goal here. And then, of course, as always, if there's certain things that you've always wanted to know about a parrot, I mean, we're happy to spend some time looking into it and learning more about it ourselves, and then sharing it back with you guys here on the podcast. So you can always shoot us an email or send us a direct message on social media. And that's been a fun episode. I can't wait for all the fun stuff we have planned for season 3. So, all right, amazing, guys. Well, thank you so much for joining me for our podcast today. And Ashley,
be kind to your parrot, and your parrot will be kind to you.
All right, guys. Thanks so much.
Thank you.